just in Bethlehem, 4 or 5 nights a week, the army comes in to arrest someone. And if they're not coming into Dhisha, they're coming into Aida camp.
Hazem Jamjoom is the editor of Al-Majdal, the English-language quarterly magazine of the Badil Resource Center for Palestinian Residency and Refugee Rights in Bethlehem, Palestine. Alternate Focus sat down with Hazem in his office in the West Bank, where he explained the history of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
So what the Oslo Agreements does is it transforms what remains of the leadership of the PLO into something called the Palestinian Authority. And this Palestinian Authority essentially, and I mean, some people accuse the PLO leadership of treason and this and that. For this, looking at the time that this agreement was signed, there were very few options open to the PLO. It was either essentially cease to exist altogether, and I mean, some people will say, well, you should have just done that, or try to find some kind of solution. Some kind of settlement, the idea being like live to fight another day. But what they knowingly or unknowingly, and I think like they knew what they were signing on to, but didn't know how far it would go, and just how tightly Israel intended to squeeze them, was they agreed to a solution, or not solution, they agreed to this arrangement whereby the Palestinian Authority would take control, and they would essentially become a municipality. They would take municipal control over certain Palestinian areas, particularly the high-density areas, so the cities and the big towns. And Israel would take control over the rest. And then the agreements say that in the future, we'll start transferring some of the rest of the West Bank and Gaza over, if you're good, if you're obedient. And obedient and good means officially what's called clamping down on terrorism. On the ground, it means that any Palestinian activism, it becomes the responsibility of this Palestinian liberation movement leadership to clamp down on liberation movement activities. Armed, unarmed, doesn't matter. As long as there are activists in the society, and the society is trying to protect itself against the ongoing Israeli military assaults, and to try to reclaim any of the land that was taken, has been taken by the occupation and the apartheid regime, then it becomes the Palestinian Authority's responsibility. And so the motto of Israel during the 90s, and everyone who was watching news during this period remembers, Yasser Arafat and the PA are not doing enough to clamp down on terrorism. We'd hear this almost every day in the news. And it would be the excuse, the cover, for Israel just continuing with the implementation of the maximum land under Jewish control, minimum Palestinians on the land. The way that looked in the West Bank was an explosion of settlement activity. The number of settlers in the 90s doubled after the signing of the Oslo Agreements, even though the Oslo Agreement talked about, the process of removing settlements, etc. In addition to the explosion of the settlement activity, again, hundreds, if not thousands, of acres of Palestinian land are confiscated during this period outside of these Area A, the Palestinian high-density population centers, the cities and the towns. And then mobility begins to be restricted. Basically, Israel establishes hundreds of checkpoints throughout the West Bank and Gaza to control movement in and out of Palestinian cities, the Area A areas. And it's all dependent on Palestinian ID cards. The Palestinian Authority also becomes responsible to issue Palestinian ID cards, the main purpose of which is for use at Israeli military checkpoints. So again, intentionally or unintentionally, the Palestinian Authority becomes this administrative mediator for the Israeli apartheid system. In particular, the mobility restriction regime and the area of security. What the Oslo Agreements also sort of include is an agreement that Israel can build these things called bypass roads, which aren't what they sound like, dirt roads that are tiny. They're these massive multi-lane roads with what they called sanitary areas on both sides, and then barbed wire fence in many cases sort of with an electric charge on both sides. And so these roads connect the settlements to one another and connect the settlements to the rest of the country. And if you look at them on a map, you see that the combination of the settlements, these settler roads or bypass roads, which Palestinians, of course, have no access to, and because of the fences, you can't even cross the street, so it's essentially a border. In addition to the military bases and the military roads, again, which Palestinians can't access, carve up the entirety of the West Bank into little islands. Some of them big islands, some of them little islands. All of it relative, of course. And all of this is taking place on less than 20% of historic Palestine. So the negotiation process becomes which part of this 20% is Israel willing to hand over to the Palestinians? And this still continues to be what the peace process, so-called, is essentially negotiating over this 19, 20% of historic Palestine. In 2000 at the Camp David Accords, where Barak made his so-called most generous offer ever of 97%, this was 97% of the 20%. As Israeli professor Jeff Halper puts it, in a prison, the prisoners control 97% of the prison. It's the 3% of the walls and the barbed wire and the watchtowers that makes it a prison. And this was exactly what the West Bank had turned into. Of course, it's much more than 3% that the Israelis control, and it continues to grow. Actually, around half of the land of the West Bank is essentially controlled by the settlements and the different infrastructure. And then 2002, 2003 is the kind of, everything is made concrete, literally, with the construction of Israel's separation wall, also called the apartheid wall and the confiscation wall. And the protective or preventative wall. The main excuse is that it'll keep suicide bombers out of Israeli cities and protect Jewish civilians. In reality, what it does is it just creates a wall around Palestinian areas with watchtowers. So there's a physical transformation of what remains of Palestine, both in Gaza and the West Bank, into prisons, into open-air prisons. And the wall is still being constructed, and phase 3 of the wall is even aims to completely confiscate what remains of the Jordan Valley and what they call the eastern border. It's most severe, or you can see it most severely in Jerusalem and Qalqilia and sort of northern West Bank and in Jerusalem, but it affects all of the eastern side of, sort of the western side of the West Bank as well. But the walls is not all just concrete wall. Much of it is, it's the wall and its regime. So it's the wall and the settlements and the checkpoints and the fences and the roads and the military bases. This is what the wall is. It's the wall and its regime that has transformed Palestinian areas into open-air prisons. And the process of confiscating the land of and forcibly displacing the Palestinians outside of the wall, those who remain in these other areas, is ongoing and accelerating. So every day there is home demolitions, land confiscations, settlement expansion, settlers harassing Palestinians, which is part of what makes people think that it'll be safer to leave where they are and go somewhere else. And the idea is to, like with the Negev, the Naqab, to concentrate all of the Palestinians of the West Bank into just the cities and to take control of the rest. And it's very evident. It's hard to miss if you know what you're looking at. But Israel tries to make it look beautiful for people who don't know. So if you don't know and you come to the country and you hear about how the heroic Jewish people, after centuries of anti-Semitism and the Holocaust, came and created a thriving economy, and look how beautiful it is. Of course, they don't show you the West Bank. Even on the Israeli side of the wall, it's often made to look pretty, or it's hidden behind a sand dune or a hill. So you don't necessarily, you can come here and not see this. But if you come to the West Bank, or if you know what it is that you're looking at, when you see a Palestinian house in Ajami neighborhood in Yafa, or in Lid, or in Ramle, or when you see the police stations in the Palestinian schools, then it's hard to miss. So for anyone who opens their eyes just enough, they'll see what's really happening here. Now, I started by talking about Zionism. The main issue continues to be Zionism. The idea, the racist, discriminatory idea, applied anywhere, this would be a racist and discriminatory idea. But it's particularly irritating here in the sense that this piece of land has been continuously inhabited, maybe longer than most others in the world. And like I said, Jericho is the oldest city in the world, continuously inhabited. And over these 11, 12,000 years of people living here in cities and in towns, and I mean, so many people have come through as conquerors, as guests, as refugees, as pilgrims. And so even if you look at our faces as Palestinians, you'll see the wide spectrum from white and blonde to black and dark-haired, right? And sometimes two brothers or sisters, one will be much lighter, will be white and blonde, and the other will be black and dark-haired. And this is because the Palestinian identity, and as a result, Palestinian identity itself is not a racial identity or an ethnic identity. And the idea that one group can come and say that this is just going to be exclusively ours, to the exclusion of everybody else, is ridiculous. It's a big crime. And like I said, it would be a crime anywhere for one group to come and say, and especially if they don't even live there, for them to come from outside and say, you, the indigenous people of the land, have no right to this land. It's a crime in North America, and it's a crime in South America, it's a crime in South Africa and in Australia, and it's an ongoing brutal crime here. And maybe what makes it a little bit different here than in some of these other cases is that the actual physical, brutal, daily violence continues. So we have the same problems as Native communities in North America and Australia and Latin America of poverty, of ongoing land confiscation, of misery. But add to this F-16s and tanks, daily arrests, 11,000 Palestinians held in Israeli jails, and just the sheer violence and brutality of daily life under occupation in the West Bank and Gaza. And in Gaza, of course, it's perhaps one of the worst places to be right now in the world, given that there's no access to medicine, food, water, petrol. You can't move. Nobody can come from outside. You can't go outside, with very tiny exceptions, where it's all governed by the Israeli military and what it allows to happen. So this is why we consider, we called what happened in 1948 the Nakba, or the catastrophe, but it wasn't a singular event that came and ended. The refugees are still refugees. Today there's around 7 million Palestinian refugees, many of whom languishing in refugee camps still, with high population density, high disease rates, and rampant poverty, and vulnerability. In the case of Iraq, Palestinian refugees who were considered a little bit better off than Palestinian refugees elsewhere, after the US occupation of Iraq, were essentially made vulnerable to, thousands have been kidnapped, disappeared, tortured, killed, and those who weren't essentially tried to run, tried to go and find safety elsewhere. Jordan and Syria wouldn't let them in, and so the thousands of Palestinian refugees ended up on these border camps on the borders of Jordan and Iraq and on the borders of Syria and Iraq. And now we're just waiting for a country to say, okay, we'll take in 5 families, we'll take in 20 families, we'll take in 30 families. In the case of Lebanon, Palestinians refugees are still not allowed to work in over 70 jobs. And if you can't find work, then why go to school? The situation in the camps is really horrible, and particularly because of the vulnerability. And this was highlighted last year in 2007 when a small band of largely non-Palestinian armed militants came and used the northern camp of Nahr al-Barid as their base of operations. And the Lebanese army, partly also to show that it still had some muscle after it was Hezbollah that repelled the Israeli attack, went in and just destroyed the entire camp. It flattened it. I saw a picture of Nahr al-Barid and I honestly thought it was an ashtray. And it took me a while to figure out that these were actually just the rubble of the houses, right? And I mean, refugee camps for the past 60 years have been subject to this. In 1970, the Jordanian military wanted to essentially kick out the PLO and focused its military might on the Palestinian refugee civilians in the refugee camps, often by besieging them and bombarding them with artillery, like Baqa camp. In the case of Lebanon, throughout the civil war, particularly after the PLO left and the fighters weren't able to defend the camps anymore, right after there was the massacres of Sabra and Shatila, but even before that, the Syrians and the fascist parties within Lebanon had besieged and destroyed the camps of Tell al-Za'atar, of Jisr al-Basha, and then after this, allies of various regimes through the War of the Camps had besieged Sabra and Shatila again, Rashidiyya camp, Burj al-Barajne camp. In the West Bank and Gaza, of course, the refugee camps have been particularly hard hit in terms of the just brutal violence. Most recent examples are, of course, in Gaza, where the camps are continually under military assault, but also in the West Bank, we remember Jenin refugee camp, what happened there under Operation quote-unquote defensive shield, when the army came in with the bombs and the bullets, but also with the bulldozers, and basically took out the central neighborhood in the refugee camp and killed tens of people, massacred them. The bullet holes in the school at Aida camp are still there for you to see, In some places, things have been renovated and taken off, but... and every night, and this is no exaggeration, every night, one of the refugee camps in the West Bank, if not more, experiences a military invasion for the purpose of extracting a prisoner, is to basically arrest someone or more. Just in Bethlehem, 4 or 5 nights a week, the army comes in to arrest someone. And if they're not coming into Dhesh, they're coming into Aida camp. And the same is with the refugee camps in Nablus and around Ramallah. In addition to all of the other things that we've talked about, displacement and refugees and economic conditions and squeezing us into areas that are open-air prisons, there's just the sheer fact of a brutal military occupation. It's soldiers who run the West Bank. And the law here is not the law passed by a parliament. And international law has, they can criticize, they can say that we condemn. The UN issues these kinds of reports regularly because it's UN workers who actually come under attack sometimes in the West Bank and in Gaza. The UN doesn't look at what happens in 48 Palestine in Israel, right? So there's very little coming out from the international community on what's happening in the Negev or in the Palestinian cities or in the Galilee. But in the West Bank and Gaza, there's reports that come out. The UN Special Committee to investigate Israeli crimes in the occupied Palestinian territories just came out. This committee isn't allowed to come into Palestine. The UN Special Rapporteur on Palestine, on the occupied Palestinian territory, is not allowed in to look at what's happening. Right? After the Jenin refugee camp, the UN wasn't able to send a committee, a fact-finding mission, because Israel wouldn't let them in. But what does come out is just ignored. Right? There's an International Court of Justice opinion. This is like the highest court in the world, supposedly, that says, yes, the wall and its associated regime are illegal. They're a war crime and a crime against humanity. And Israel says, all right, so? Right? And this is Israel's response to these things. Okay, so? Or no, it's not. Come do something about it. And the reason that Israel is able to do all of this continually is because the international community, all right, these reports and these condemnations come out, but they're not willing to do anything about it. On the contrary, the European Union just upgraded its trade relationship with Israel. The United States continually upgrades its support for Israel. Barack Obama just hired one of the most ardent Zionists in the United States as the White House Chief of Staff. So the relations with Israel and the support for Israel only increases on the material level. Money, weapons, diplomatic support, visits, celebrations. Every leader in Europe and North America came and celebrated the 60th birthday of Israel. George Bush spoke in the Knesset to sing happy birthday for Israel. Meanwhile, that same week, people were being arrested and killed in Gaza and in the West Bank, and houses were being destroyed in the Negev and in the West Bank and in Gaza. So this is what allows Israel to continue to do this, right? I mean, most of these missiles and bombs and bullets are made in the US and shipped here, right? So the bullets in the people who are killed here are made in the USA, right? As are the F-16s and the bombs dropped by them, etc. All right, as far as I understand it, the official Israeli line after 1948 was, one, we were attacked by Arab armies, and there was a war, and we won. And in the course of a war, people get frightened and flee. Two, Arab leaders issued radio broadcasts to Palestinians telling them to leave. Now, on both of these counts, there's some huge historical flaw. First of all, let's start with the radio broadcasts. Basically, all the radio broadcasts were archived by the British, and the archives are still there for anyone to go and look at. And there's not one Arab radio broadcast telling people to leave. In fact, later on in the war, there's tens of radio broadcasts telling people to stay because these Arab regimes didn't want any more Palestinian refugees flooding in. Two, the idea of the Arab army, at first the Arab armies invaded, and then we, Israel, defended ourselves, and in the course of the war, people left. It's just historically completely inaccurate, right? Arab armies did not invade until May 15th, and everything before that is Israeli military forces implementing Plan Dalit, and this is all in the Israeli military archive, and for the most part, it's Israeli historians who have brought out these documents. Some of them Zionists, right? Benny Morris, who has written one of the main textbooks on this, his position is our big mistake was we didn't kick out all of the Palestinians in 1948. So he's no pro-Palestinian. But in his research, he says, no, the military talks about each village that we destroyed and we kicked the people out, right? So, and this is before the establishment of the state, and then even more so after the establishment of the state, right? Like it didn't require massive military prowess to defeat the Arab armies of the time, when you've already sort of neutralized the Jordanian and Iraqi armies, which are the only ones that are an army to speak of at the time, through an agreement. So most of the military efforts were continued to be, I mean, after Plan Dalit had been implemented and the communities were connected and the borders were cleared out of the Palestinian community, the military was just like, why should we stop here? And they just kept going and cleared out as much of the land as they could, which meant everything except the West Bank and Gaza. So now today, it's much more muddled, right? People still rehash the old myths, like the radio broadcasts. People still talk about radio broadcasts, even though 3 separate sets of historians have gone into the archive and said, no, they're not here. There's no radio broadcast. But still, if you go onto some Zionist websites, you'll find but there were radio broadcasts, and people left because the Arabs told them to leave. 2, even though also the well-researched record is very clear on the fact that Israeli military operations aim to kick Palestinians out of this. Also on the intentionality, the premeditated nature of the ethnic cleansing of Palestine. The fact that people like David Ben-Gurion and Moshe Sharet and like the big leaders of the Zionist movement had written and made it very clear that we're going to have to force Palestinians to leave. The main response to the issue of the refugees is, and I mean, this is where it all comes down, right? This is the central issue of Palestine, is if we allow the refugees return, it'll challenge the Jewish character of the state, right? Plain and simple. And this argument is successful for some reason in Europe and North America. Like some people buy it. Oh, the Jewish character of the state. And I mean, maybe there's something understandable that the world still feels guilty about the Holocaust that they committed, particularly in Europe. And this is some kind of like reparations for that. But it wasn't Palestinians who committed the Holocaust. And secondly, you don't provide reparations for one crime by allowing another crime to be committed. I've painted a very depressing picture, and it's a very tough situation here. But of course, the people continue to be strong and steadfast. But one thing that, if we want to find the hope and if we want to look for how people can help end what's happening here and try to reverse it, so that people can live with dignity, Jewish people and the indigenous Palestinian community can live with some form of dignity, both of them, not just one at the expense of the other, then we need to stop international support for Israel. The international community needs to say, okay, Israel, we're not going to support you anymore until you implement just international law. Palestinians aren't asking for more than this. There's something called international law. Supposedly, this is the will of the international community. Israel is a signatory to many of these things, like the Geneva Conventions. Just implement them, or stop the violation of them. You know, it's very basic. Refugees, people who've been forced to leave their homes and forced into a situation where they can't go back to their homes, have the right to come back to their homes. I mean, it's pretty basic, right? So, okay, Israel wants to talk about the demographic threat and this and that. It's only a demographic threat if the ideology underpinning your regime is a racist ideology that says Jews only. Well, sorry, not in Palestine. You know, if Palestine was an empty island before Jewish colonization, then you can have, you know, a Jewish-only state, a Muslim-only state. Do whatever you want. Nobody's going to object. But if the majority of the people who were here before are not Jewish, and you come here to create an exclusively Jewish state, then you're going to face opposition. And the international community should not condone this kind of racism, especially when it causes so much destruction and death every day. So if we want to look for a sign of hope, we find it in this new emerging global movement for boycott, divestment, and sanctions on Israel. And essentially what this movement is saying is there's three demands. Implement the rights of the Palestinian refugees to go back to their homes and reclaim their lands. Implement the right of Palestinian citizens of Israel to full equality before the law, which means stop destroying their houses and stop evicting them from their homes and give them their land back. And dismantle this apartheid and occupation infrastructure in the West Bank and Gaza. No more walls and checkpoints and military coming in and killing our children every day. These are the three demands. They're very basic. Okay, politically they're extremely complicated or whatever, but this is what the demands are. And isolate Israel until it implements just international law. Just what the international community already says is what it wills.